Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. I work remotely as a data analyst, which means I need rock-solid internet. Not the basic package your average person gets, but the premium fiber optic connection that costs me about $150 a month. It's worth every penny when you're dealing with massive data sets and video conferences where any lag could cost you a client. I live in a duplex in what I thought was a quiet neighborhood, sharing a wall with my neighbor on the right side. For the first few months after I moved in, everything was fine. My connection was blazing fast, my work calls were crystal clear, and I could stream 4K content without a hiccup. Then something started going wrong. It started small. A video call would stutter for a few seconds, a file upload would take longer than usual, nothing major, just enough to be annoying. I figured it was network congestion during peak hours or maybe some maintenance my ISP was doing, but then it got worse. Last Tuesday, I was in the middle of a crucial presentation to a client when my video feed completely froze. I could hear them asking if I was still there, but my camera had turned into a pixelated mess. After the meeting, which thankfully I managed to salvage, I decided to investigate. I logged into my router's admin panel, something I probably should have done weeks ago. What I found made my blood boil. 12 devices were connected to my network. 12. I live alone and have maybe 4 devices total that use Wi-Fi. I started going through the device list. There was my laptop, my phone, my smart TV, and my tablet. Then there were 8 other devices I didn't recognize. Someone had named their devices pretty obviously too. There was something called Gaming Beast, which was clearly a console, Smart Fridge Supreme, a couple of phones with names like Mom's iPhone and Son's phone, and what looked like several laptops and streaming devices. The bandwidth usage logs were even more infuriating. These unauthorized devices were eating up nearly 60% of my monthly data allowance. The gaming console alone was pulling massive amounts during peak hours, which explained why my work calls kept dropping. Someone was essentially running a small internet cafe off my dime. I knew exactly who it was. My neighbor had been a little too friendly when I first moved in, asking lots of questions about my work and whether I had good internet since she worked from home too. She mentioned something about her previous neighbor being really cool about sharing things and how the neighborhood had a community spirit. At the time, I thought she was just being welcoming. Now I realized she was fishing for information about whether I'd be as pushover as the previous tenant apparently was. The more I dug into the router logs, the more furious I became. These devices had been connected for months, practically since I moved in. The timestamps showed heavy usage patterns that lined up perfectly with my internet problems. When I was trying to work in the mornings, someone was streaming Netflix. When I had evening calls, someone was gaming online. I decided to do a little detective work before taking action. I changed my router settings to show more detailed device information and discovered that several devices were using static IP addresses, which meant they'd been configured as permanent connections. This wasn't casual mooching. This was a deliberate, long-term theft of my internet service. The final straw came when I noticed that one device called Etsy Business Hub was running what looked like constant uploads during business hours. This person wasn't just stealing my internet for personal use, they were running a business off my connection. I spent about an hour documenting everything. Screenshots of the device list, bandwidth usage charts, connection timestamps, everything. Then I made my move. First, I changed the network name from the generic one the ISP had set up to something new. Then I updated the password to something complex with WPA3 security enabled. I also enabled MAC address filtering, which meant only my approved devices could connect even if someone somehow got the new password. I hit save on the router settings and watched as all the unauthorized devices immediately disconnected. My internet speed jumped back to normal instantly. It was like someone had removed a weight I'd been carrying for months. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. About 10 minutes later, there was aggressive knocking at my front door. Not the polite knock of someone asking for a favor, but the demanding bang of someone who was angry. I looked through the peephole and saw my neighbor standing there with her arms crossed, looking furious. I opened the door and put on my most professional customer service voice. She didn't even give me a chance to say hello. She immediately launched into me about how I'd broken the internet and demanding to know what I'd done. She wasn't asking politely for the new password or apologizing for using my connection without permission. She was angry that I'd cut off her access. Her main concern seemed to be that her son was in the middle of some online gaming tournament and I was ruining his chances by cutting off the connection. When I calmly explained that it was my private internet line and I hadn't given anyone permission to use it, she shifted tactics. She told me she was a single mother on a tight budget and couldn't afford her own internet plan. The Wi-Fi signal reached her apartment, so in her mind that made it partly hers since it was entering her airspace. She actually used those words. She said wireless signals that crossed property lines became public property, like radio waves. I explained that's not how internet service works, but she wasn't listening. She kept insisting that the previous tenant had been community-minded and that she had a grandfathered right to the connection since she'd been using it for over a year and a half. When I politely declined to share the password, she started getting more aggressive. She accused me of being a bad neighbor and suggested that maybe she should talk to the property management about my selfish attitude. I remained calm and simply said that if she needed internet, there were plenty of affordable plans available through various providers. She stomped off, muttering about how she was going to fix this situation and that I hadn't heard the last of it. I closed the door and figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when I happened to glance at my doorbell camera app. There was motion detected in the hallway near the building's utility area. I pulled up the live feed and couldn't believe what I was seeing. My neighbor was crouched next to the external ISP junction box with what looked like a butter knife, trying to pry it open. She was muttering to herself and occasionally looking around to see if anyone was watching. I started recording the feed on my phone. She spent about 15 minutes trying different angles with the knife before apparently giving up. I saved the video file with a timestamp and noted the incident, but decided not to intervene just yet. I wanted to see how far she would take this. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes under my door about being a considerate neighbor and sharing community resources. One note suggested that since I worked from home, I obviously made enough money to help out struggling families by sharing my internet. The notes got increasingly unhinged. She started claiming that my high-powered router was interfering with her electronics and causing health problems. She said the stronger signal I was using was giving her headaches and disrupting her sleep patterns. But the real nuclear option came about a week later when I received a formal notice from the property management company requesting my presence at a meeting to discuss neighborhood complaints and utility interference. The notice was vague, but it mentioned concerns about electromagnetic interference, inconsiderate use of shared resources, and potential health and safety violations. It was clear my neighbor had decided to involve the authorities. I called the property management office to get more details. The woman I spoke with was professional, but seemed a bit confused by the complaint herself. She explained that a tenant had filed a formal grievance claiming that another resident was broadcasting dangerous frequencies and monopolizing internet resources that should be shared among neighbors. The complaint apparently included a detailed log of internet connectivity problems, documented outages, and claims of business interference. My neighbor had also alleged that I was somehow stealing her internet access and demanded that the property management force me to share my connection as reparations for the emotional distress caused by the service disruption. I asked if I could see the complaint, and the property manager agreed to email me a copy. What I read was absolutely stunning. My neighbor had created a multi-page document detailing every time her internet had been slow or unavailable over the past several months. She'd included timestamps, duration of problems, and even estimated financial losses from her online business operations being disrupted. The complaint claimed that I had been illegally blocking her access to internet service she had been grandfathered into by the previous tenant. She argued that since she'd been using the connection for 18 months without issues, she had established a utility easement that I was now violating. Most incredibly, she claimed that my high-powered commercial-grade equipment was interfering with her basic residential internet needs and potentially violating FCC regulations about signal strength in residential areas. The property manager scheduled a meeting for the following Friday to discuss the situation with both parties present. She mentioned that if there was indeed some kind of interference issue, they might need to involve the HOA or even contact my ISP directly. I spent the rest of the week preparing. I printed out my ISP contract, highlighting the sections about unauthorized access and residential service terms. I compiled all my documentation about the unauthorized devices, including bandwidth usage charts and connection logs. I also researched FCC regulations about Wi-Fi signal strength to prove that my setup was completely legal and standard. Most importantly, I called my ISP and asked them to investigate potential service theft on my account. I explained that I had evidence of unauthorized usage and wanted it documented officially. They scheduled a technician visit to verify my equipment settings and told me they would open a formal investigation case. The day of the meeting arrived and I showed up to the property management office with a folder full of documentation. My neighbor arrived a few minutes later carrying her own thick stack of papers and looking very confident. The property manager started by explaining that this was an informal mediation to resolve neighbor disputes before they escalated further. She asked my neighbor to present her complaint first. What happened next was beautiful to watch. My neighbor launched into a detailed explanation of how she'd been using the internet connection for 18 months without any problems until I moved in and changed everything. She explained that she had been running her online Etsy business using the connection and streaming movies in 4K without issues. She pulled out printed screenshots showing slow speed tests and documented all the times her business operations had been interrupted. She complained that her son couldn't play his online games anymore and that she couldn't afford the expensive internet that I apparently had. The property manager asked her to clarify whether she had been using my internet connection without permission, and my neighbor confirmed that yes, she had been using it, but claimed it was with implied consent from the previous tenant and that I was disrupting an established arrangement. When it was my turn, I simply pulled out my ISP contract and highlighted section 4.3, which specifically states that sharing residential internet service with non-household members constitutes theft of services and can result in criminal charges. I also showed the section that prohibits using residential service for commercial purposes. Then I presented my router logs showing 12 unauthorized devices consuming over 500 GB of data monthly. I explained that my work requires a reliable connection and that this unauthorized usage was interfering with my professional obligations. The property manager's expression changed as she realized what was actually happening. She asked my neighbor directly if she had been using my internet connection for business purposes, and my neighbor proudly confirmed that yes, her Etsy shop depended on it and that cutting off her access was destroying her livelihood. I then mentioned that I had already contacted my ISP about potential service theft and that they were investigating. I pulled out my phone and called the investigation case number they'd given me, putting it on speaker. The ISP representative confirmed that using residential internet service for commercial purposes without authorization constitutes theft of services under state law. They also confirmed that my connection was properly configured and not interfering with any other services in the area. When the property manager asked what resolution my neighbor was seeking, she demanded that I be forced to share my password and that the costs be split between us since we were both benefiting from the service. The property manager looked at me and asked what I thought about that proposal. I calmly explained that beyond the legal issues, my work requires dedicated bandwidth and that sharing the connection would continue to interfere with my professional responsibilities. Then I dropped the real bomb. I mentioned that I had video evidence of my neighbor attempting to tamper with ISP equipment, which was both illegal and potentially dangerous. I showed the property manager the doorbell camera footage of her trying to break into the junction box with a butter knife. The meeting effectively ended at that point. The property manager said she would need to consult with the building owners and possibly legal counsel about the situation. She asked my neighbor to stop using my internet immediately and warned that tampering with utility equipment was grounds for eviction. 2 days later, I received a call from the property management office. They had spoken with their legal team and determined that my neighbor's demand had no merit. In fact, they were considering formal action against her for utility tampering and theft of services. But the real satisfaction came later that week when my neighbor received a certified letter from my ISP. They had calculated her usage based on my router logs and were billing her for 18 months of commercial tier service, which runs about $400 per month. The total bill was over $7,000, plus penalties and legal fees. The ISP also sent her a cease and desist order threatening criminal charges if she attempted to access any of their customer networks without authorization in the future. The property management company fined her $500 for tampering with utility equipment and placed a formal reprimand in her tenant file. They also installed a security camera near the utility area to prevent future incidents. But here's the part that made me smile the most. During all of this drama, I hadn't actually blocked her devices specifically. Instead, I had enabled a guest network with no password and a speed limit of 0.5 megabits per second. When I changed my main network settings, her devices had automatically connected to this severely throttled connection. For weeks, she had been trying to run her business and stream videos on a connection barely fast enough for basic web browsing. That's why her business operations had been failing. Not because I was blocking her, but because she was now limited to speeds so slow they were basically unusable for anything demanding. When I finally told her this in a polite note explaining why her internet had been so terrible, the look on her face was priceless. The final touch came when I decided to install signal shielding film on our shared wall. It's a simple metallic film that blocks Wi-Fi signals from passing through. Now her devices can't even see my network name, let alone try to connect to it. I also upgraded my router to a newer model with better security features and created a guest network specifically for legitimate visitors with a daily time limit and automatic disconnection. These days, my internet works perfectly. My video calls are crystal clear, my file uploads are lightning fast, and I can stream 4K content without a single hiccup. My productivity at work has improved dramatically now that I don't have to worry about connection issues during important meetings. As for my neighbor, well, she's had to find alternative solutions. I see her sitting in her car in the public library parking lot most Tuesday evenings, presumably using their free Wi-Fi for her business operations. She also bought one of those old-fashioned antenna systems for basic TV reception, which I can see mounted outside her window. She tried to get basic internet service through the cheapest provider available, but apparently her credit was too poor to qualify for the standard residential plans. She ended up with a prepaid mobile hotspot that gives her about 10 GB per month for $50. The irony is that if she had just asked politely in the beginning and offered to split the cost of an upgraded plan, I might have considered it. But her entitled attitude and illegal behavior made that impossible. The property manager told me later that this wasn't my neighbor's first complaint. She had apparently tried to get other tenants to share various utilities and had filed grievances against previous neighbors for noise violations and inconsiderate behavior when they didn't comply with her demands. There's a lesson here about respecting other people's property and understanding that just because you can access something doesn't mean you have a right to it. Wireless signals might travel through walls, but the service they provide belongs to whoever pays for it. I also learned the importance of monitoring your network regularly. If I had checked my router logs sooner, I could have prevented months of degraded service and probably saved myself some stress. The whole experience taught me that documentation is crucial when dealing with difficult neighbors. Having video evidence, usage logs, and official documentation made it impossible for her to deny what she had been doing or claim ignorance about the legal issues. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable people is to let them talk themselves into trouble. By staying calm and professional while she made increasingly outrageous demands, she eventually confessed to theft of services in front of a witness. The property manager mentioned that this incident had prompted them to update their lease agreements to specifically address utility sharing and network access. Future tenants will have clear guidelines about what's allowed and what constitutes theft of services. My ISP also used this case as an example when training their customer service representatives about how to handle service theft complaints. They told me it was one of the most well-documented cases they'd seen and thanked me for my thorough preparation. In the end, my neighbor got exactly what she deserved. She wanted to run a business using stolen internet service, and now she's paying commercial rates for it. She complained about interference and got cut off entirely. She tried to manipulate the system and ended up with fines and legal trouble. Meanwhile, I'm enjoying the reliable internet service I pay for, working productively without interruptions, and sleeping well knowing that my network is secure. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting entitled people face the natural consequences of their actions. She created this entire situation by choosing to steal rather than pay for her own service. Everything that happened after that was just the inevitable result of that choice. The funniest part is that she probably spent more money on legal fees and fines than she would have paid for her own internet service over the same period. If she had just gotten a basic plan when she first moved in, none of this would have happened. But I guess that's the difference between people who take responsibility for their needs and people who feel entitled to take what others have worked for. She chose the path of theft and manipulation, and it led exactly where such paths always lead, to consequences and accountability. I still live in the same duplex, and we're technically still neighbors, but we don't interact anymore. She avoids eye contact when we pass in the hallway, and I'm perfectly fine with that arrangement. Every time I see her sitting in her car at the library, I remember why I pay for a premium internet service, and why it's worth every penny. Not just for the speed and reliability, but for the peace of mind that comes with having something that's truly mine, that no one can take away or interfere with. She wanted to steal my internet, and when that didn't work, she tried to force me to share it through complaints and manipulation. Her plan backfired spectacularly, and now she has to live with the consequences of her choices. That's the thing about entitled behavior. It might work in the short term against people who don't want conflict, but eventually you'll encounter someone who won't be bullied or manipulated. When that happens, all your past behavior catches up with you at once. I hope she learned something from this experience, but honestly I doubt it. People like her rarely take responsibility for their actions. They just find new targets and try the same tactics elsewhere. But that's not my problem anymore. I've got fast internet, clear video calls, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice was served. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. The story could have ended differently if she had simply apologized and offered to work out a legitimate arrangement. But she chose confrontation over cooperation and manipulation over honesty. Those choices led inevitably to the outcome she deserved. Now, when people ask me about dealing with difficult neighbors, I tell them this story. Document everything, know your rights, stay calm and professional, and let unreasonable people dig their own graves with their words and actions. It's amazing how often entitled people will confess to wrongdoing when they think they're making a compelling argument for why they should be allowed to continue their bad behavior. My neighbor literally admitted to theft of services while trying to justify why she should be allowed to continue stealing my internet. The legal principle is simple. Theft is theft, whether it's taking someone's car or using their internet without permission. The fact that wireless signals can't be contained within property lines doesn't make them free for anyone to use. She learned that lesson the hard way, and I learned valuable lessons about network security and neighbor management. Overall, despite the stress and hassle, it worked out well for everyone except the person who was in the wrong to begin with. And really, that's exactly how these situations should end. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So I work in a science lab, and normally we write up our results for the day around 2 p.m. when all of the testing is done. We leave at 3:30. The boss's boss, being mostly admin and managerial, works 9. 5. The boss's boss wants this report magically earlier in the day before we're done with all of our testing. He walks into the lab holding one of the reports. This is paraphrased. I need this earlier. You guys are always giving it to me after the day's already over, and I can't make any changes. I need to know what's going on sooner rather than later to make adjustments. 11 would be much better. I try explaining the report's done at 2 because that's when all of the numbers are in. If I do it earlier, it won't be complete. He says back what will be missing. This and this, I point to the sections. He says, oh, those aren't important, we don't make changes based on those. So I ask him to send me an email as a reminder to me, and to the rest of the lab as well, so they can make this change. Will do. He walks back down to his office and sends it. I'm floored. So I ask my direct boss, and she smiles too, knowing what would happen. For the full month we comply, but we leave 2 uninteresting numbers off the daily report every day, simply because the numbers aren't in yet, the testing hasn't been done, everyone in the lab is on board with this. So the end of the month comes around and the boss is looking to print out his monthly compliance report, and he has a big empty section for 2 pages. He can't figure it out. All of us have left by 3:30, and what should be a simple 5-minute print and hole punch job he does at the end of every month, he has to go find where 2 points of data are kept. Boss's boss was stuck staying late on the last day of the month to get the report in. My boss ignored his calls for a few hours, but finally gave in around 7 to get back to him to tell him where he could find the numbers. Everything is labeled in the lab. He should have been able to resolve it himself. He was there till about 8 putting data in. The next one is an entitled people story. As any who have read my previous posts are aware, I work security doing staff escorts, building lockups, alarm response, and inspections of facilities that have been hired. For the most part, the job is uneventful, with people not paying attention to the time and running long with their booking. Every once in a while, though, I come across people who, were it not for my training and reluctance to use violence, I feel an almost overpowering urge to give a thick ear. Tonight was supposed to be simple. A wedding reception was being held in a hall in the local library I secure every night at the same time. I enter through the usual way, conduct the usual checks of the toilets, remember this, to make sure no one was trying to remain after hours, and proceed with usual routine. It is by the last door I needed to check that I found tonight's thorn in my proverbial paw. Sitting by one of the automatic exits, now locked, many council buildings are smart buildings capable of locking themselves, phone plugged into a charger, doing his best to ignore me when I told him the building was closed. Apparently, leaving was not on his to-do list for the night, as he just sat there, flicking through his phone while trying to tell me he was awaiting a friend in the toilet, which, if you remember, I had just checked and found none but a wedding guest. I thought I'd give him the benefit of the doubt and check the toilets. There was a slim chance someone had gone into them in the few minutes after I checked, and frankly, it would look bad on the paperwork if I simply assumed he was lying. To my complete and utter lack of surprise, there was no one. Returning to the man, I told him I didn't appreciate being lied to and again asked him to leave. Naturally, his story changed. His friend was upstairs and I should go and find him. Do you remember those smart buildings I mentioned? That applies to door inside the building as well as outside. There are only 4 ways into the upper level, through an elevator that after hours requires a pass card to activate, a door at the top of some stairs that could also be opened with a card or someone opening the door from the upper level, and through the fire escapes that required a key to unlock. Knowing this, I called him out for another obvious lie, at which point the story changed again to his friend was a part of the wedding party. Again, pursuing due diligence, I asked one of the guests if they knew the man. They didn't, but were kind enough to alert the bride, who confirmed the man was unknown to her. Determined to remain civil one last time, I approached him and again told him to leave, with no apparent effect. Being totally fed up by this point, I pulled his phone charger and threw it out the automatic doors to which he was seated. That finally got his attention as he stood up and tried to intimidate me with his height and claiming I had just assaulted him. Knowing I hadn't touched him, I called his bluff and opened the automatic doors, through which he finally left. He tried goading me into doing something stupid like going out and fighting him, but I knew better than to stoop to his level. He lost interest when I pointed out there were cameras all over the area, and they would clearly show I hadn't touched him, and any fight would start with him being the instigator. Seeing I wasn't going to give him what he wanted, he walked off around the corner of the building. This is where I was a bit stupid. I saw him staring at the cars parked next to the building and, thinking he might be trying to work out which one was mine to damage it, opened the door to monitor him from a distance. It appears that is what he was waiting for, as he quickly strolled back into the building, ignoring me once more when I repeatedly yelled at him to leave. He sauntered through the building's public area and left via the doors on the other side. As he left, I told those wedding guests gathered that he'd been warned he was trespassing 4 times, and if he returned, they could call the police straight away. Being Aussies at their most Aussie, I was quickly informed that if he did return, they'd just thump him. D. Thankfully, that is the extent of incident as far as I know. I've made a report and will request that, if he can be identified via the cameras that really were there, he be banned from the building, hopefully ensuring I never have to deal with the jerk again. If I do come across him, I'll let you know. I just feel sorry for the poor bride who had her wedding interrupted by his idiocy. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading, and Merry Christmas. The next one is an entitled parent story. We have never had a good relationship. For as long as I can remember, my relationship with my mom has always been fraught, full of arguments, guilt-tripping, and gaslighting on her end, controlling behavior, silent treatments, and attempts to sabotage my goals. A few years ago, I finally left my home country permanently, and am now happily married and fully established in my new home. The last time I visited my home country, halfway around the world, was in late 2023, about 2 years after I moved out permanently. I was there for a week and Mum complained I wasn't there long enough and should be spending more time with them. I also had various catch-ups with friends, etc. lined up. She is now pestering me to visit again because my dad, who I also do not have a great relationship with, is getting a benign tumor removed in January. Given we have never had a good relationship, I think you understand why the prospect of visiting doesn't exactly fill me with excitement. I said we would think about visiting, but it wasn't always possible due to the expense. It being so far away, the flights always cost a bomb, not to mention accommodation, as I never want to just stay at my parents' place. And my husband and I only have so many leave days, which we also want to use to visit other places. But my mum only has herself in mind and says things like, "Don't you miss us? Lol, no," and "Your dad is sick." Maybe it's bad of me to say this, but he's not terminally ill and I don't see an urgent need to rush back. I hate the entitlement. I'm sick of being pestered to drop tons of money on trips that I know I won't even really enjoy when I could be off on another holiday with my husband. And I'm sick of being told whatever length of time I visit is not enough, and her complete lack of understanding or empathy that we have our own busy lives here, and her refusal to accept that where she lives is no longer my home and I can't just stay there for weeks and weeks. Not to mention the utter lack of compromise. Whenever I float the idea of them coming to visit US instead or meeting somewhere abroad to spend time together, I get shot down with, "It's too expensive, we can't afford it, but it's fair for us to bear all the costs and effort every time." Okay, just wanted to get this off my chest. Anyway, thank you for watching.